Okay, something weird is happening in America right now. And the craziest part, almost nobody is talking about the secret operation hiding just beneath the surface. I mean, the only evidence that America just spent a massive chunk of change propping up Japan's economy is a photograph of a handwritten to-do list. Seriously, it was caught on camera, sitting right in front of the U.S. Treasury Secretary, completely legible from across the room. It literally said, "to buy Japanese yen." This wasn't some grand formal policy announcement. No, it was a doodle on a legal pad, snapped by a long-lens camera at exactly 11:33 in the morning on July 31st. And just like that, boom, an international financial intervention was triggered.
So the number jotted down on that notepad, it was between $5 and $10 billion. $10 billion. That Friday afternoon, for the first time since 1998, the United States quietly waltzed into the global currency market and started buying up Japanese yen. But here's the really bizarre part. Right now, the rate America pays to borrow money for 30 years has been hitting its highest levels since 2007. So the obvious question is, if our own borrowing costs are through the roof, why on earth are we suddenly playing hero in the currency market? What exactly are we buying with that $10 billion?
Well, if you ask the politicians, the answer is super simple. You get this very stiff, official narrative all about friendship and market stability. President Trump essentially came out and said, we have a very strong relationship with Japan, their currency was struggling, they wanted a little help, and we're always there for them. And over in Tokyo, their finance minister echoed the exact same vibe, using that classic robotic treasury speak about countering excessive volatility. Basically, the public story was, Japan was hurting, and America stepped in like a good buddy to make the pain stop. It sounds nice, right? But there's one massive problem with that explanation.
You see, you can't just find billions of dollars buried in the White House couch cushions on a Friday afternoon. So where did that money actually come from? The U.S. tapped into something called the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Think of this as the Treasury Secretary's personal, multi-billion-dollar piggy bank. It's a pot of money that can be spent with just a stroke of the president's pen, completely bypassing Congress. But here's the kicker. America didn't even use dollars to buy those yen. Nope, they sold off about $13 billion worth of euros from this fund. They literally dumped Europe's currency to buy Japan's, shattering decades of unwritten rules, and European officials only found out after the checks had already cleared. Wild, right?
And when you look at the timeline, the whole thing builds into an absolute glaring contradiction. On July 23rd, the U.S. Treasury dropped its official watch list, flagging countries they're keeping a close eye on for artificially manipulating their currencies. Guess who was on that list? Yep, Japan. But then, literally 8 days later, on July 31st, the exact same building that published that warning used a secret slush fund to buy billions of dollars of Japan's money to bail them out. The sheer absurdity of this is just wow. We broke a 20-year precedent, alienated Europe, and did it all for a country we just officially labeled a currency risk. To figure out why, we need to stop looking at this as a political story and start treating it like a financial detective story.
To unravel this mystery, we have to start at the very root of the problem. Why is Japan's money collapsing in the first place? What was so utterly terrifying about the falling yen that it forced the United States to tear up its own rulebook and stage a covert intervention?
The answer comes down to basic, brutal math. For decades, Japan has kept its borrowing costs pinned straight to the floor, near zero. Recently, they've started inching that up, getting their benchmark rate to around 1%. But America's interest rates? They're sitting way higher, around 3.5%. Now here is why that is so crucial. Capital does not catch feelings. Money doesn't care about loyalty. It just flows to wherever it gets paid the most. So, global investors look at those two numbers, dump their yen, chase the higher yield in US dollars, and effectively drive Japan's currency right off a cliff.
Now, you're probably asking yourself, well, why doesn't Japan just raise their interest rates to match America's? It makes sense, right? But they can't. They're trapped by a financial monster of their own creation. To keep those rates at zero for so long, the Bank of Japan had to step in and buy its own government bonds, year after year after year, until they basically owned half of the entire Japanese government bond market. Think about that. They essentially solved their debt problem by buying their own debt, which pays absolutely nothing.
So, here is Japan's impossible choice. It's a real rock-and-a-hard-place situation. If their central bank raises interest rates to save the falling yen, they instantly have to start paying out trillions in interest to commercial banks. But remember, they're still collecting virtually nothing on that massive mountain of zero-yield bonds they bought up. They would literally bankrupt themselves overnight. So they can defend the yen, or they can afford the interest on their own debt. Pick one. They absolutely cannot do both.
Because they can't raise rates, Japan only has one card left to play to defend their currency. They have to go into the market and buy yen themselves, which usually means selling off US dollars. And here, Right here is the bombshell connection that brings this entire story crashing back to American soil. Japan actually has the dollars to do this because they are the single largest foreign owner of American government debt on the planet. I mean, they hold more U.S. debt than the UK, more than China, more than anyone. But those reserves aren't just sitting in a massive checking account. They are tied up in U.S. Treasury bonds.
The catch is, you can't just hand a U.S. Treasury bond to a currency dealer and ask for change. It doesn't work that way. To get the hard cash needed to save the yen, Japan had to start selling. And man, did they sell. In just 1 month, Japan mounted the largest currency defense in its entire history. To fund it, their holdings of American government debt plummeted by $66.7 billion. That was the single largest 1-month drop in Treasury holdings by any country in recorded history. Japan panicked, desperately needed dollars, and just flooded the market with American paper to get them.
At first, it actually worked. But then reality set in, and we entered what finance nerds call the FX intervention doom loop. Here's how it plays out. Step 1. Japan sells U.S. bonds. Step 2. Because they suddenly flood the market with bonds nobody was asking for, the price of those U.S. bonds drops. Step 3. When bond prices drop, the interest rate the U.S. government has to pay to borrow money spikes. Step 4. Because U.S. rates just went up, the gap between America and Japan gets even wider, capital floods right back to America, and the yen falls even further. It is literally a machine that eats its own tail.
Now, if you're sitting there thinking, okay, global bond markets, foreign exchange, why does this matter to me? I totally get it. But here's the thing. When U.S. borrowing costs spike because a foreign country is dumping our debt, it hits your wallet directly. Those U.S. Treasury rates, they are the bedrock for the entire American credit market. When they go up, the mortgage rate for your house goes up. The interest rate on your auto loan gets more expensive. Your credit card payments jump. Japan's currency panic was actively driving up the cost of living for everyday Americans. Suddenly, the whole narrative shifts, doesn't it? America woke up and realized its biggest lender was out there publicly demonstrating they were fully willing to dump U.S. bonds just to save themselves. In a market where long-term borrowing costs were already sitting at historic highs, a massive sustained sell-off from Japan threatened to crash the entire American credit market. The U.S. absolutely desperately needed to stop Japan from selling our debt. And that brings us to the real reason for that Friday afternoon intervention.
The U.S. had to figure out a way for Japan to get their hands on dollars without dumping their American bonds. Enter the FEMA repo facility. I know it sounds like boring financial jargon, but just think of this as a highly exclusive pawn shop run by the Federal Reserve. A foreign central bank can walk in, hand over $100 in U.S. bonds, and the Fed gives them $100 in cash. Then the next day, the foreign bank buys those bonds back for $101. It was built specifically for this exact scenario, so countries like Japan can raise quick cash without vomiting American debt all over the open market.
It's a pretty simple trade-off. If Japan sells bonds, it crashes the U.S. market. But if they pawn those bonds, it protects the U.S. market. Now get this, just 48 hours after the U.S. secretly bought those yen, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on national television publicly begging the Federal Reserve to expand this FEMA pawn shop facility. The weird part? That facility was completely empty at the time. Literally nobody was using it. You don't publicly ask the central banks to expand an empty facility unless you are absolutely terrified that your biggest creditor is about to need a massive loan to stop them from panic selling your debt.
And hey, you don't just have to take my word for it. Just listen to Mark Sobel. This guy is a heavyweight who spent 40 years inside the U.S. Treasury working on international monetary policy. He pointed out that aside from throwing a bone to a friend, the Treasury was likely extremely concerned that a weak yen could push American long-term rates higher. This quote right here completely shatters the official narrative. It confirms the real motive was never about being good buddies. It was about the absolute terror of an American interest rate explosion.
So what we're really looking at is this incredibly fragile hidden arrangement between two massive global economies, both desperately trying to balance each other out without spooking the general public. The U.S. buys Japan's currency to stop them from crashing our bond market while simultaneously setting up a giant pawn shop to lend them dollars. It's a high-wire act. But how long can this possibly last? And what happens next?
Based on the hard evidence, we are basically looking at 3 main scenarios. Scenario A. Conditions continue exactly as they are. The rate gap stays super wide, Japan is forced to keep defending the yen, that doom loop we talked about accelerates, and U.S. consumer rates just soar. Scenario B. Conditions reverse. The U.S. actually lowers its interest rates, the gap closes naturally, and the immense pressure on Japan's currency finally eases up. Or Scenario C. The unexpected outcome. Japan's internal debt trap finally snaps. They are forced to sell their bonds regardless of the pawn shop, and the global bond market suddenly breaks under the sheer weight of trillions of dollars moving all at once.
The official story that was fed to the public was this heartwarming tale of international friendship. But when you actually look at the data, the secret use of the Exchange Stabilization Fund, and the sudden desperation to expand an empty repo facility, the truth is completely unavoidable. We didn't bail out Japan. We bailed out ourselves. That $10 billion doodle caught on camera wasn't an act of foreign aid. It was America aggressively protecting its own wallet from an absolute catastrophe. So the next time you see the government quietly stepping in to help an ally, you really have to ask yourself, whose economy are they really trying to save?